Buried inside a 14-point memorandum signed in the middle of June 2026. In a single clause most people scrolled straight past, sits a number large enough to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up. $300 billion. Not a loan, not a grant from the United States Treasury, a fund written directly into the ceasefire agreement that ended a brutal war between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other, with a single sentence committing Washington to help build it. At least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That sentence has already become one of the most fiercely argued pieces of American foreign policy in years. Senators have stood on the floor of Congress comparing it to the cost of every road and bridge the federal government builds in 5 years combined. The Vice President of the United States has gone on national television to insist, repeatedly, that not 1 cent of American taxpayer money is going anywhere near it. And on the ground in Tehran, ordinary Iranians are buying bread at prices that have more than doubled in a single year, watching a currency that has lost most of its value. While their own government quietly debates whether $300 billion in foreign money, attached to serious strings, is rescue or just a different kind of cage. This is the story of how that number got there, who actually controls it, what Iran's economy looks like right now without it, and why both sides of an extraordinarily messy negotiation have very good reasons to want you to believe a completely different version of what this fund actually is. If you want to understand one of the strangest financial instruments ever written into a war-ending agreement, and what it tells you about how reconstruction money actually works in the real world rather than in a press release, stay with me because this gets more complicated and more revealing the deeper you go. And if stories that take apart the fine print behind major world events are what keeps you coming back to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe right now because we're just getting started. Let's start with the war itself, because you cannot understand why $300 billion suddenly became the headline number without understanding exactly what it's supposed to repair. In the spring of 2026, a conflict that had been building for years between Iran, Israel, and the United States escalated into direct, sustained military confrontation. American and Israeli strikes targeted Iranian nuclear facilities, energy infrastructure, and industrial sites across the country. Iran answered by closing in on the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which more than 90% of its own trade and roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply normally passes. The United States responded with a naval blockade. For weeks, the conflict didn't just damage buildings. It strangled the basic mechanics of an entire national economy, cutting off imports, halting exports, and freezing the financial plumbing. An industrialized nation of more than 80 million people depends on every single day just to keep functioning. The price of that war, in purely economic terms, is almost unimaginable. Iran's own government spokesperson estimated total war-related damage at approximately $270 billion in April of 2026, a figure officials cautioned could climb higher as full assessments continued. To put that number in perspective, Iran's entire annual economic output, its GDP, sits at roughly $341 billion. State media in Tehran did the math explicitly. The damage estimate represents nearly 80% of the country's entire yearly economic production, wiped out in a matter of weeks. Iran's central bank reportedly warned President Masoud Pezeshkian privately that, combined with the country's already fragile pre-war economic position, a full recovery could take as long as 12 years. And the damage wasn't abstract. Major airports were hit. Oil refineries and petrochemical facilities, the backbone of Iran's export economy, sustained serious damage, with the national petrochemical company suspending all exports entirely in mid-April just to stabilize what was left of the domestic market. Before the war, that sector alone generated between $13 and $15 billion a year in foreign currency, Iran's second largest source of revenue after oil. Labor leaders inside Iran, the kind of state-linked voices that rarely admit hardship publicly, acknowledged the war had eliminated 130,000 direct jobs and roughly 600,000 more indirectly, with officials privately cautioning the real number could be considerably higher once the full picture emerged. Then came the inflation. Iran was already running inflation above 50% in 2025, before a single shot of this latest war was fired, the legacy of years of sanctions and currency instability. By the spring of 2026, food inflation alone had surged past 100%. Specific categories tell the story even more sharply than the overall number. The price of bread and cereal climbed 140% in a single year. Red meat and poultry rose 135%. Cooking oil and fats jumped 219%. The Iranian central bank, in a detail that says more than any statistic could on its own, issued a 10 million rial banknote, the largest denomination in the country's history, simply because smaller bills could no longer keep up with the prices people were actually paying at the market. The rial itself, Iran's currency, lost 60% of its value in the months following an earlier 12-day conflict with Israel. then kept falling, hitting a fresh all-time low of roughly 8 million rial to the dollar by early May. This is the economic reality the $300 billion fund is supposed to address. Not an abstract diplomatic gesture, but an attempt to answer a very concrete question. How do you rebuild a national economy that has lost the equivalent of 80% of its annual output, alongside double-digit job losses and triple-digit food inflation, when the country doing the rebuilding has spent decades locked out of most of the global financial system by sanctions? And the damage from this war was never going to stay neatly inside Iran's own borders, which is part of why the rest of the world has been watching this conflict, and its aftermath, so closely. The World Bank cut its entire global economic growth forecast for 2026 down to 5%, the lowest projection since the coronavirus pandemic, citing the war as a major contributing factor. Gulf economies, the bank estimated, would see their combined growth slow to just 1%. 3% for the year, down sharply from 4%. 5% the year before. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the subsequent American naval blockade disrupted roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas shipments, rippling into energy prices, fertilizer shortages, and cooking gas shortages as far away as India. Stock markets fell globally. Bond markets sold off. A war that started as a regional conflict between 3 countries ended up, within months, registering as a measurable drag on the entire planet's economic growth, which is exactly the kind of broader stake that makes a stable, well-funded Iranian reconstruction matter to people who have never thought about Tehran, Hormuz, or Rial banknotes in their entire lives. That question is exactly where the fund enters the story, and exactly where the controversy begins, because the actual text agreed to by President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian on June 17, 2026, is far less specific than the headline number suggests. The memorandum states that the United States undertakes with regional partners to develop a definitive, mutually agreed plan with at least $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It commits Washington to granting whatever licenses, sanctions, waivers, and other permissions the eventual plan requires, and it leaves the single most important question, exactly how this money gets raised, who contributes it, and under what conditions, to be worked out during a 60-day negotiation window that followed the signing. In other words, the number was locked in before the mechanism was. That sequencing alone explains almost every argument that's happened in Washington since. Within hours of the memorandum becoming public, American politics did what American politics does with any large, vaguely defined dollar figure attached to a foreign country. It turned the number into a domestic political weapon almost immediately, with very little regard for what the actual text said. Democratic lawmakers seized on the figure first. One senator framed it in terms designed to sting. With $300 billion, the senator argued, the country could end homelessness, fund cancer research for 40 years, and provide free pre-kindergarten for every American child for more than 7 years. Another congressman put it more bluntly. Republicans claim they cannot find the money to protect Americans' health care, he said, but they found $300 billion to send to Iran. Republican Representative Thomas Massie, a frequent critic of his own party's leadership, calculated that the figure amounted to 5 times what Congress spends on the entire country's roads and bridges in a single year. President Trump's response was immediate, direct, and unambiguous. There is no $300 billion payment to Iran from the United States, he posted publicly, calling the entire framing fake news and Democratic propaganda. Vice President J.D. Vance went further in a series of interviews, stating flatly that not a cent of American taxpayer money goes to Iran under this arrangement. It's worth pausing on exactly why this number landed with so much political force, because $300 billion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists specifically in the shadow of the 2015 nuclear agreement negotiated under President Obama, commonly known as the JCPOA, which Trump withdrew the United States from unilaterally in 2018 and has spent years criticizing publicly ever since. That earlier deal released roughly $55 billion in frozen Iranian assets, money mostly held in foreign banks, in exchange for Iran curtailing its nuclear program and submitting to international inspections. Senator Roger Wicker, a Trump ally and longtime Iran hawk, made the comparison explicit and pointed. Even if the new $300 billion fund isn't funded directly by American taxpayers, he said, it would make Iran's payoff under the 2015 deal look like a pittance by comparison. That single comparison crystallizes exactly why this number became such an immediate flashpoint rather than a quiet diplomatic footnote. A president who built years of his political identity around rejecting a $55 billion nuclear deal as a catastrophic giveaway has now put his own name on an agreement involving a number more than 5 times larger, even if the underlying mechanics of the two deals are genuinely different in important ways. When pressed by reporters on exactly where the money would actually come from, Vance pointed toward the Gulf. regional Arab states and outside investors interested in Iran's economy, he suggested, paid for and structured entirely outside the American federal budget. He specifically named the United Arab Emirates as an example of a country that might want to invest in projects like power plants inside Iran, something current sanctions make legally impossible right now, regardless of who's willing to pay for it. Here's where the actual reporting gets genuinely interesting, because while American politicians were arguing about whether this represented a taxpayer giveaway, Reuters reported something considerably more specific, citing a source with direct knowledge of the deal. The fund, as currently envisioned, is structured entirely as a private investment vehicle, not a government program, and more than half of the full $300 billion had already been informally committed by private companies before the memorandum was even signed. According to that reporting, companies based in the United States, across the Gulf Arab states, and in Asia, South America, and Africa had reportedly agreed in principle to commit financing across energy, logistics, manufacturing, and transportation projects inside Iran. Firms from South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia were specifically named among the interested parties. None of that money, under this structure, would ever touch the U.S. federal budget, which makes Trump and Vance's core claim technically accurate. It also doesn't make the senators' framing entirely wrong either, because the deal explicitly requires the U.S. government to grant the licenses, sanctions waivers, and legal permissions that make any of this private investment possible in the first place. Without an active decision by Washington to open that door, none of the $300 billion, private or otherwise, goes anywhere near Iran. The argument over whether that counts as American taxpayers paying for Iran's reconstruction, or simply America permitting private global capital to flow, there is, ultimately, a genuine philosophical disagreement, not a simple factual one, and reasonable people have landed on both sides of it. There's a deeper origin story behind the number itself that almost never makes it into the political shouting match, and it's worth knowing because it changes how you read the entire negotiation. According to a senior Iranian source who spoke to Reuters, Tehran's initial position in these talks wasn't $300 billion at all. It was $400 billion, framed explicitly as compensation, war reparations owed directly by Washington for the damage American and Israeli strikes had caused. The United States flatly rejected that framing and that figure. The Reconstruction and Development Fund, as it came to be called in the final text, emerged specifically as the alternative both sides could actually agree to sign, a lower number, structured as voluntary private investment from willing third parties rather than mandatory compensation paid by the country that caused the damage, with conditions attached rather than handed over unconditionally. That distinction, reparations demanded versus investment offered, is not a small rhetorical difference. It's the entire reason this deal exists in the form it does, and it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the moment a number this large becomes a domestic political talking point in a country that wasn't even the one negotiating the original $400 billion demand. And the conditions attached to Iran's actual access to this money are, by every account from officials directly involved, genuinely serious, not cosmetic. Vance has stated explicitly, multiple times, that Iran would only gain access to these resources if it complies fully and changes its behavior, language that, in this specific negotiating context, means dismantling its nuclear enrichment program and eliminating its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, among other commitments still being finalized. Iran currently holds more than 440 kilograms of enriched uranium, according to figures cited in regional reporting, a stockpile that sits at the absolute center of why this war started in the first place, and why any reconstruction money comes wrapped in nuclear-related strings, rather than handed over freely. This is precisely where the deal's framing becomes, in the words of one Middle East analyst speaking to Al Jazeera, a genuine dignity problem for Tehran. The analyst, Mohammad Saloom, described the situation bluntly. Tehran reads this as supervised, conditional money rather than sovereign relief. For a government that just fought a war, partly over the principle of resisting external control over its own nuclear program and its own sovereignty, accepting $300 billion in reconstruction financing that's explicitly contingent on dismantling that same program, administered through a process where Washington controls every necessary legal permission, is not a simple, uncomplicated lifeline. It's a profoundly difficult political and psychological needle for Iran's own leadership to thread in front of its own population, regardless of how badly the money is actually needed on the ground. And it is badly needed, by almost every independent measure available. The International Monetary Fund's own World Economic Outlook projected Iran's economy would shrink by 1% in 2026 alone, with inflation reaching nearly 69% for the year, a level that erodes ordinary people's purchasing power on almost a weekly basis. The country hasn't published official GDP data since 2024, and the widespread internet blackouts imposed during and after the war have made even Iran's own domestic economic statistics, which independent analysts already considered unreliable before any of this started, almost impossible to verify from outside the country at all. What outside observers can verify paints a picture of a society absorbing enormous strain. Mass layoffs, business closures, triggered by both direct war damage and the government's own extended internet shutdowns, and a labor market hemorrhaging jobs across sectors that depended on stable electricity, functioning ports, and predictable export markets that simply don't exist right now. There's also a parallel, separate track, running alongside the Reconstruction Fund that often gets confused with it in casual reporting, and it's worth untangling clearly because it changes the real total at stake. Beyond the $300 billion fund itself, the memorandum separately commits to immediately lifting sanctions on Iran's fossil fuel industry and opening negotiations to unfreeze billions of dollars in Iranian sovereign assets currently held in foreign banks, frozen there under years of accumulated sanctions. Iran's own state-affiliated Mehr news agency reported a separate figure, $24 billion in frozen assets potentially up for release, though Vance specifically pushed back on that exact number when pressed by reporters, stating it doesn't appear anywhere in the actual negotiating texts under discussion. What both sides do agree on is that these frozen assets and the Reconstruction Fund are entirely distinct mechanisms, governed by different timelines and different conditions, even though public discussion of the deal regularly blends them into one single larger number. Reuters, reporting specifically confirmed this separation. The investment fund and the asset unfreezing track are described by sources close to the deal as distinct mechanisms with different purposes, not one combined payout. So who, in the end, is actually positioned to benefit from all of this, and who carries the real risk if the entire arrangement collapses before the 60-day window closes? For the Gulf Arab states, particularly the United Arab Emirates, which absorbed direct damage during the broader conflict and had previously demanded reparations from Iran for the destruction caused to its own territory, contributing to a fund that stabilizes Iran's economy, serves multiple interests simultaneously. It creates a financial and political stake in Iranian behavior going forward, since regional governments that have actually invested real capital in Iran's recovery now have direct leverage to insist that money doesn't quietly find its way back into rearming Tehran's military. It also reopens a market of more than 80 million people to companies based in the Gulf and beyond, at a moment when Iran's own desperate economic position makes it more open to outside investment than it has been in decades. For companies in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia reportedly already committing capital, the calculation is more straightforwardly commercial. A sanctioned, war-damaged economy of this size represents either a genuinely enormous emerging opportunity or a genuinely enormous risk, depending entirely on whether the underlying ceasefire actually holds and whether Tehran follows through on the nuclear commitments the fund's access depends on. For ordinary Iranians, the calculation looks completely different and considerably more urgent. 12 years is the estimate Iran's own central bank reportedly gave its president for how long a full economic recovery could take without major outside support. Every month that estimate holds without resolution is another month of triple-digit food inflation, another wave of layoffs in sectors still recovering from direct strikes, another stretch of unpredictable internet access disrupting whatever commerce manages to continue functioning at all. For families inside Iran right now, the question of whether $300 billion eventually arrives wrapped in geopolitical conditions they find dignified or humiliating is, in many real and immediate ways, secondary to the much more basic question of whether their currency stabilizes, their jobs come back, and bread becomes affordable again before the next bad year arrives. For the United States, finally, the calculation is almost entirely about precedent and political risk, rather than direct cost, precisely because the deal is explicitly structured to keep American taxpayer dollars out of the fund itself. If the private investment structure actually holds as described, with Gulf and Asian capital filling the vast majority of the $300 billion target, the Trump administration gets to claim a genuine diplomatic win, an end to active war, a path toward dismantling Iran's nuclear program, and zero direct cost to the American budget. If the private commitments turn out to be softer than reported, or if Congress proves unwilling to roll back the sanctions legislation it has spent decades building specifically to make Iranian transactions difficult for foreign banks and investors to touch, the entire fund risks becoming exactly what its critics already claim it is, an enormous number written into a historic agreement with no actual mechanism behind it to make it real. So where does this leave us 60 days? And counting from a memorandum that promised answers it deliberately didn't provide. The $300 billion fund is real, in the narrow sense that it exists in writing in a signed agreement between two heads of state, with both sides publicly committed to finalizing how it actually works. It is not, despite what a chaotic first week of American political reaction might suggest, a direct transfer of U.S. taxpayer money to Tehran. And it is not, despite what the administration's most confident public statements might imply, a fully settled, fully funded, ready to deploy reconstruction package either. It sits right now in the genuinely uncomfortable space between a real commitment and a real uncertainty, contingent on private companies actually following through on informal pledges, contingent on Congress being willing to roll back sanctions it spent years building, and contingent, above everything else, on Iran actually agreeing to dismantle the nuclear program that started this entire war in the first place. Whether that combination of conditions ever fully aligns is, as of right now, genuinely unknown, even to the people who negotiated it. If you want to understand the stories sitting underneath the headlines that everyone else is just shouting about, this channel exists specifically to dig that deep every single time. Go ahead and subscribe now, because as this 60-day window plays out, there's going to be a lot more here worth tracking closely. Here's the question I want to leave you with, because I think it's the one that actually matters once the political shouting dies down. If a $300 billion private investment fund really can be built without a single dollar of American taxpayer money, structured entirely around voluntary capital from Gulf states and Asian companies eager to get into a reopened Iranian market, does it actually matter to the average American? Whether the headline calls it a fund for Iran, or simply America getting out of the way of other people's money? Or is the deeper concern something else entirely? The fact that an agreement this consequential, covering nuclear weapons, sanctions, and hundreds of billions of dollars, was signed with the single most important detail: who actually pays, and under what enforceable terms, left completely unresolved for 60 days after the signatures were already on the page? Tell me where you land in the comments, because I think the honest answer reveals more about how you see this entire deal than any single number in it ever could. And if you want to know exactly what happens when that 60-day window closes, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere near finished.